Put your seatbelts on and get ready for the ride. We're the freaking New York Jets, so we're built for this shit.
Hello, welcome to another episode of In the Trenches with Gang Green. I'm your host, Bubbs. Today is Monday, February 17th. Hopefully everybody's having a good day so far today. This is episode 493 of the In the Trenches with Gang Green podcast. I thank you, as always, for joining me. For those tuning in on YouTube, make sure to please like and subscribe. Of course, thank you to all those tuning in on all the different audio podcast platforms as well. Appreciate your support. Today, we're going to break down some New York Jets news. Rich Spielman posted an article yesterday, kind of his typical Sunday news dump with everything happening around the New York Jets, and want to talk about some things about Garrett Wilson that were mentioned in the article, along with Rick Spielman being impressed by Jaxson Dart, and if that's a realistic option for the New York Jets in the 2025 NFL draft. So we will break that out all down today. As always, though, before we begin, we got to get into our podcast partners, starting with our friends over at BetUS, America's favorite online sportsbook. For those of you looking to get in on any of the sports betting action, check out BetUS and use my link in the description of this video to get a 125% sign-up bonus on your first 3 deposits up to $2,000. Also, our friends over at SeatGeek, if you're looking to get out to the best in sports and entertainment, looking to buy a ticket for anything, not just sports, but anything that requires a ticket, SeatGeek has it. And if it's your first time using SeatGeek, use promo code BUBSONSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase and get yourself out to some awesome events. And of course, our friends over at Huga House, if you want any of their new arrival hats or brand new arrival sweatshirts, check them out and use promo code BUBS for 15% off any purchase. And with that code, you can also get 30% off your second purchase. So check them out and get yourself some awesome Huga House swag. So here we go, episode 493. It is a Monday, starting off another week, another day closer to free agency, another day closer to eventually figuring out the answer here at quarterback for the New York Jets in 2025. But today I wanted to break down some comments or some things yesterday that Rich Spielman reported in an article revolving around Garrett Wilson and the possible Jaxson Dart draft here for the New York Jets. I want to start with Garrett Wilson, a little bit more of the Aaron Rodgers fallout kind of being mentioned here. I'll throw it up on the screen here. This was Spielman. Impact on Wilson. Rodgers' departure greatly increases the chances of Garrett Wilson's return. There appeared to be tension in their relationship last season, that started with heated conversations on the field in training camp. It bubbled up in the season, fueling speculation that Wilson might ask for a trade. It became obvious to some players that last season that Rodgers was favoring Adams over Wilson in the passing game. In 11 games together, Adams was targeted 112 times, third most in the NFL, Wilson 87. The disparity was even greater in the red zone. Adams 21, Wilson 11. Wilson 24, coming off of 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons, is the kind of player most teams would want to be a part of their foundation. So that was Spielman on the whole Rodgers-Wilson relationship. And this is interesting because we've heard some different reports on how Rodgers and Wilson were together. We heard some reports that Wilson was more, upset about the losing. We've also heard some reports that there was clearly tension there. I don't know really if we'll ever get the level of the amount of tension between the two, but I do certainly think that there is substance to this, that Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson didn't have the best relationship. I do think there is some part of that is true, where whether you want to start in training camp, I don't even know if I'd go as far as training camp. I would maybe just say after the Davante Adams trade where Garrett, we all watched the games, turned into a number 2 receiver, which was completely ridiculous because Rodgers was favoring Davante, especially late in the season when he was basically force-feeding the ball, especially in the red zone, to try and get his 500th touchdown. I think that's really when the problems occurred. And I don't think this was a Jets choosing Rodgers over Wilson, because if that's the case, look, 100% of the time, you take Rodgers or you take Garrett Wilson over Rodgers and Davante for 1 year in 2025 because Garrett Wilson's a cornerstone piece. I think this is really just, again, showing the importance of this new regime needing to make sure that Garrett Wilson buys into their plan, gets this thing on the right track, and gets him to believe and be able to extend him. Right? There's a lot of Jet fans, not me personally. I understand the Rodgers decision. I'm okay with them moving on. You guys know how I feel about that. But there are a lot of Jet fans that are upset with the Aaron Rodgers decision. The best way for Darren Muji and Aaron Glenn to get this fan base a little bit more bought back in, to get this team headed in the right direction for 2025, one of the best ways to start that is by extending Garrett Wilson and is by keeping him a Jet for life. This guy is a blue chip cornerstone piece, is an excellent wide receiver, and I don't think he's as much of a diva as people make him out to be, as the media makes him out to be. I think he's a guy that wants his targets, wants to be involved, especially when halfway through the year, he basically just turns into the number 1 receiver for no reason other than Rodgers wanted to force feed it to his friend in Davante, which I think we can all agree. I think he's a guy that wants targets, wants his opportunities, just like every wide receiver. That's not a diva. That's every wide receiver in the NFL wants to contribute and help the team win. I also think Garrett just wants to win. And I think that's the importance of still trying to compete in 2025. I don't think Garrett or any of these other guys want to go out there and win 5 games in 2025 or want to go into 2025 with the mindset of this is a reset year and then we're going to go and win in 2026. No, that can't be the case. And I still think the New York Jets can compete in 2025 even without Aaron Rodgers. I think a lot of people, like we've said on this podcast many times, are overstating what Rodgers did last year. Rodgers was a average quarterback last season. He was average. He wasn't above average. He wasn't below average. He was average. In fact, if you really look at the numbers, he was probably a bit below average. When you look at all the numbers and put them all together, he ranked about the 20th quarterback in the NFL, which is about average, maybe a slight below. Either way, that's where he was. You can get that production. You can get similar to that production with an improved run game, with an improved wide receiving core around Garrett, because the Jets need to work on that, and an improved defense, and just flat out competent coaching. Right? You just get competent coaching, this team can win 2 to 3 more games next year. You get competent offensive play calling, offensive scheming from Tanner Engstrand, you can automatically win another game or 2 next year. You get competent kicking, you can win an extra game. It's not that crazy to see this team still compete even without Aaron Rodgers. So that's the point I'm really trying to make. Garrett Wilson, obviously the Rodgers departure seems like it increases his chances with coming back, which is great. And I do think there was some friction there. I don't know what the level of it was. I don't know if those training camp blowups really were the problem. I think that was, because you always saw them, they would kind of handshake it off and they would kind of just move on from it. I think that was more so them trying to get on the same page. I think a lot of the tension really comes from, and Samini mentioned it here, a lot of it really comes from late season, because everybody looks at Garrett Wilson's targets and say, oh, he's at 154. That was tied for 4th in NFL with Justin Jefferson. Yes, that needs context, though. There needs to be context to those targets. And in fact, he actually had less targets this year than he had last year, which is certainly interesting. So there's context to everything. You also look at the numbers, right? Davante was targeted 112 times to Wilson's 87 in the 11 games they were together. That's a massive, massive discrepancy, especially in the red zone, where Garrett Wilson, we've said all year going into last season, needs to be a bigger piece in the red zone. He needs to have more touchdowns, which, look, he had 7 touchdowns. That was the same amount he had in his first 2 years combined. So the Jets need to make sure, and this is, I think, a positive, that with Rodgers gone, maybe the chances of Garrett returning, it seems like likely increase, greatly increase, as a matter of fact, is what Cimini said here. But the Jets need to make sure they extend Garrett Wilson. That's the biggest thing. Keep him here long term. You don't trade him. Keep him here long term. He's a cornerstone piece. And make sure that you have a plan laid out for him that he can believe in, where you could still compete and retool in a way at the same time. Because that can be done. We've seen it many times throughout the NFL. Rebuilds don't last forever. There really isn't rebuilds anymore. It's really more so retools in the NFL. That's kind of where we're at. A rebuild's a 3-4 year thing. That's what the Jets just went through, and it didn't work out. A retool is a 1 to 2 year thing, similar to the Lions. Year 1 was terrible, saw growth in year 2, year 3. Jets need to be quicker than that, and I think they can be, because they're in a much different spot than Detroit. They're more talented than Detroit was at the time. They're also more talented than with where this team was at post-Gaze, and that's why they could still be competitive in my eyes. And you look at some of Garrett's numbers. 51 games played in his career, 279 receptions, 3,249 yards, 11.6 yards per reception, 14 touchdowns. He's had 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons in his first 3 years. That's the first Jet to do that since George Sawyer in 1966 through the 68 season. Got to go all the way back to the 60s. This guy has already hit massive Jets records. He's also just the 5th player in NFL history to record 80 receptions and 1,000 yards in each of his first 3 seasons. He's a special talent. Keep him around at all costs. And I don't think it ultimately came down to this. I don't think Glenn and Muji sat in a room and said, okay, it's either Rodgers and Devontae or Garrett Wilson. Yeah, anybody with a brain goes Garrett Wilson. I don't think that was necessarily the case. I think the Aaron Rodgers decision, there was a lot more that went into that than just Garrett Wilson. But it certainly seems like it helps that they're moving on. Another reason to get on board with that decision. Okay, now let's move on here. Another part of this report was a little bit about Rick Spielman and his impression on Jaxson Dart. It's pretty positive. So I'll throw this up here on the screen for the YouTube audience. This was a quote from Rick Spielman after the Senior Bowl. I like Jaxson Dart a lot, better and better and better, Spielman said on the podcast at the conclusion of the Senior Bowl practices. This, of course, was his former CBS Sports podcast called With the First Pick prior to taking the senior football advisor role with the Jets. He also said it just looks like the position comes natural to him. He praises Dart's arm talent, saying it was more impressive in person than on tape. He said Dart had the smoothest, quickest release of any quarterback at the Senior Bowl. Spielman glowed about his intangibles, especially his toughness, leadership, and intelligence. I came away impressed, he said. This was also more on Spielman, which I find this part especially interesting just because of the way that the Jets could approach this draft. I'm going to say this, Spielman said. I don't know if there's another first-round quarterback after the first 2, but the way Bo Nix started to surge last year coming out of this game, I would not be surprised if Dart ends up in the first round. Nix was a late riser, wound up being drafted 12th by the Denver Broncos. The Jets own the 7th and 42nd picks. 7 probably is too high for Dart, and 42nd might be too low. So it would require some maneuvering if they target Dart. And I find that last part very interesting because I actually see Jaxson Dart, maybe even in the first round, very possible for the Jets. Now, I don't see it at number 7. That would be a massive reach. I think that's ridiculous. But I could see a world, as Cimini noted, 7's too high, 42 is probably too low. I could see a world where the Jets, especially with Darren Muji's background, where he just saw Denver, move on from Russell Wilson, take the massive cap hit, a failed all-in move. A year, couple months later, they've got Bo Nix. They make the playoffs. Everybody thought the Broncos were going to go stopgap 2025 and then, or stopgap 2024, and then go all in on a quarterback in 2025. Everybody thinks the same thing here with the Jets. I could see a world, and I'm not necessarily predicting this, but I could see a world where Darren Muji Now enters a situation, failed all-in move in Aaron Rodgers, massive cap hit. Everyone sort of expects a stopgap, which I still think would have to be the case. I don't think Jaxson Dart's a guy like Bo Nix, which we'll get to here in a second, that can just be thrown in right away. I don't think that happens. But Muji maybe sees it as this guy is kind of the Jets' version of Bo Nix, where maybe they trade back into the first round late in the first, similar to the Ravens did with Lamar Jackson, where you trade back into the late first and you're able to get him in the first, have that ability to have that fifth-year option, and kind of roll with him for a season, let him sit, maybe play at some point next year and see what you have in him. I could see where that happens. Or they just flat out wait, or it just doesn't happen, or they just take him at 42. There's endless possibilities. This is all just me speculating too. I do find very interesting, and this is where I am kind of intrigued with the whole Darren Muji addition, right? I wanted to experience all that stuff. Darren Muji was far from my top choice. But now that he's here, now that him and Glenn are here, you are intrigued with Muji, just the way that he approaches this offseason, considering he's just come from an organization in Denver that literally went through the same exact offseason last year when they moved on from Russell Wilson. The same thing. And they went 10-7 this year and made the playoffs. I'm not saying the Jets are going to go 10-7 and make the playoffs, but it's a very similar offseason with questions at quarterback. Nobody saw Bo Nix going in the first round last year. I don't think anybody really saw either Penix or Nix. Maybe Penix a little bit more than Nix. I think everybody saw Nix as a day two guy. Right? There was a lot of questions, even though he played a long time in college. There was a lot of questions about his game, and the Broncos took a risk on him there at 12. Do the Jets take a risk on Dart at 7? I don't see that, but do they see a world where Dart's kind of last year's Knicks, if they like him enough, where they maybe trade back in or just wait and hope he's there in round 2, which is probably the most likely scenario? Really, really interesting. I also think it's interesting that Rick Spielman's a part of the front office now. He obviously likes the guy. I'm sure he's going to try and push for him a little bit. And I do think it's the right move for the Jets to draft a quarterback this year. Not necessarily number 7, and I would not trade up for Cam Ward and Shedeur unless if the Jets really feel like they love one of those two guys, which I don't see that being the case. I also don't think that makes much sense for Darren Muji to trade up for a quarterback, because then it automatically starts the clock. A little bit different if you trade up into the first round for Jaxson Dart. Trading up to pick 30 or 31 to take a quarterback is a whole lot different than trading up to the number 1 overall pick to take a quarterback. Because then you're essentially asking that guy to be your franchise quarterback. Trading back into the first round gives you the 5th-year option, and you can still have him sit and learn. You're not necessarily saying this has to be our franchise guy. Trading up to 1, yeah, that's got to be your franchise guy. Obviously, if you take a guy in day 2, you're not necessarily saying this is our franchise guy. But Rick Spielman in the front office clearly likes him, and I'm sure there will be some conversations. Now, when it comes to Dart as the actual prospect, you look at his numbers last season, 69.3% completion percentage, 4,279 yards, 10.8 yards per completion, 29 touchdowns, 6 picks, and a 180.7 passer rating. You look at those numbers, those were all career highs. Career high in completion percentage, career high in yards, career high in yards per attempt, career high in touchdowns, career high in passer rating. He had a very good year. You know, after transferring from USC his freshman year to Ole Miss in 2022, he went to 3 bowl games, won 2 of them. He's gotten better each year. You look at the numbers, they've only increased. There is a lot to like. Some of the things you really like, his arm strength is very, very impressive, and he's got a lot of, his accuracy is very impressive as well. Completion percentage up to 69% is a huge positive. Now, will that be the case in the NFL? Who knows? But it's a positive. Now, the biggest concern with Dart and why he probably would have to sit a year and learn, and why you don't throw him in right away, is the offense that he's coming from in Ole Miss, where Lane Kiffin's offense was a lot of predetermined one-read plays where before the snap, Dart essentially knew where he was throwing, kind of robotic in a way. In the NFL, that's never going to last. So that's where he would probably need some sitting and learning, seeing how a quarterback goes through his reads, understanding the playbook, understanding the speed of the game from an outside perspective before just being thrown in and trying to adjust on the fly. He also, when he faces pressure, not great. And I think part of that is with the predetermined read, when he faces pressure and his read's not there, he kind of panics, and that's where you see some of those struggles. But that's where you hope you get into Tanner Engstrand's offense. You hope you can develop it. Dart is a massive riser. We knew this. I think we've kind of identified Dart for probably about a couple weeks now, especially coming out of the Senior Bowl, where he is the guy that a lot of people are just, he's like the draft darling. He is like the, Bo Nix, I feels like didn't start to surge until late last year. Dart's probably a little bit earlier, but every year you get that quarterback that surges up the draft boards. And it feels like it's Dart. And there's a risk to that because sometimes they work. Bo Nix, sometimes they don't. I'd make an argument Zach Wilson probably surged up the draft boards. I mean, this was a guy that a lot of people felt it was probably Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields. Wilson made a couple nice throws in shorts, and the Jets took a chance on him. That blew up in their face. Dart's a little bit different because you're not going to be spending the second overall pick on him. And if you take him on day 2, you're essentially just hoping it's a developmental option that maybe pans out. But really, I think you're probably looking at 2026. But it's intriguing because you've got a guy in the front office that clearly is interested. It's clearly intrigued. Maybe I should say intrigued, not interested. And you've got a guy in Darren Muji who just saw a team pick a quarterback 12th overall last year that at the time, not many people really saw working out, and they won 10 games, and he was a Rookie of the Year finalist. So, endless options for the Jets. The Jets could go many places. Many, many places. I think ideally you go Tyrod, veteran, and then Dart, or something like that. Some combination. I don't love Tyrod, Dart right there. I think you want to probably bring in another veteran to kind of have that shield and be a little bit more competitive, as opposed to one Tyrod injury away from just throwing a rookie in there right away. But we'll see. There's a lot that still needs to be ironed out. And free agency as well will be a big teller as to who they bring in veteran-wise. And you still got to kind of find out what happens with Carr in New Orleans, what happens to Cousins in Atlanta. Cousins is going to get cut. I don't necessarily know if Carr will. That'll be up to Kellen Moore and that new regime as well. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below on this latest Rich Cimini report. Over the next couple weeks here, I'm really going to start to dive into some of the free agency stuff. There's a couple guys also in this report. There was a receiver that Cimini linked to the Jets. So we'll break that down here in the coming episodes. Couple guys from Detroit that I think are possible fits for the Jets, given Engstrand and Glenn the connection there. So we'll start to break that down because we're less than a month away from the free agency, and we're also only a week away from the combine. So things are really starting to heat up. February, a little bit of a slow month, but once March hits, the offseason starts to fly by a little bit more, and you start to see a lot more action. And the Jets have a lot of holes they got to fill, and they got to figure out how they're going to fill them through draft, free agency, trade. So we'll discuss all that coming up. Stay tuned. A lot more content coming your way. Appreciate your support. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below on these two topics. We'll talk to you soon. Until next time, JETS, 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 Jets.